Hola, bienvenidos a Diálogos. En este momento voy a cambiar a inglés. Welcome to Diálogos. I am Facundo Guadagno, and I'm with Eddie Muller, that it's, well, actually well known as the Tsar of Noir. And he's going to laugh when I'm saying this. And I don't have a Noir costume, so I'm using my own costume that is from the GTA Vice City. This is a, let's say, a tribute to Ray Liotta that did the voice for the main character, and I will pay homage with to Ray Liotta that passed away a year ago, and with actually remembering one of his biggest movies, and it's Something Wild. So, Eddie, Something Wild, it has that noir atmosphere, right?
Totally. Yes. And thank you so much for remembering Ray Liotta. He's just terrific. He's to me he is one of the few modern actors that I could easily see having played in movies, back in the mid 20th century. He would have fit right in playing a tough guy or a cop or a crook or something in those older films. But yeah, I absolutely think that Something Wild is like a modern noir film completely.
Also, Ray Liotta has, because it was when you were defining film noir, you said that is people that is doing the wrong thing and they are aware of that. And Ray Liotta plays a cop in a movie that I cannot remember the name, and he is like a psychopath. He is like doing he kills an a guy and because he's trying to having the wife of a guy. It was really like, well, Jim Carrey in The Cable Guy, but even worse.
I think the movie you're referring to is Narc, right? He plays a character named Henry Oak, like one of the dirtiest cops ever. I actually think that's like the signature Ray Liotta performance. He's just fantastic in that film. I really like that movie a lot.
And
Uh,
but do you think that Ray Liotta didn't get the recognition when he was alive that he deserved, and he's basically remembered by Goodfellas?
um, that's an interesting question. I don't think he didn't get the recognition because he never stopped working. He was working all the time. And that means you've got the recognition of the people that matter, the people who pay you the money for your talent, right? I mean, and he also, because he was a tough guy and he was so good in those roles, he made genre pictures. And genre pictures never get the recognition that prestigious movies get. I mean, obviously, you mentioned Goodfellas, and that's where genre pictures and prestige pictures cross over because it's Martin Scorsese, and that's a big movie with De Niro and big stars. But I mean, he's just made so many films. It was one of the I do a lot of film festivals, and it was one of the great missed opportunities of my life that I tried several times to get him to come out to receive exactly what you're talking about, a tribute for his work, like a retrospective tribute. Like, look how many great movies this guy has made. Um, but he was too busy working. so, so he would say, thanks a lot for caring, but I'm going to go off and shoot a movie now, and I'm doing this other thing, and you talk about, this expression, dying in the saddle.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know that's what he did. I mean, he right up till the very end. Obviously, he had health issues that he shouldn't have been off making a movie. He should have been taking care of himself. But he died making a film on location. You know,
And well, actually, it is a case of being born late in this case, because Ray Liotta, as you said, it was perfect as Humphrey Bogart, for example. But in your book, Noir City. I think I'm no, it's not Noir City. Dark City. Yes, I'm sitting. I'm quoting my memory. You said that Double Indemnity is like the benchmark for film noir, and I was saying, is that true? Because I see like there's a passage with Roaring Twenties that is from 1939 to film noir, and I don't know why is that movie. Why is Double Indemnity like the benchmark for film noir?
I consider it to be that because it's the movie that really started the trend in Hollywood towards making so many of those films because it got big stars. Again, just like we were talking about how Ray Liotta didn't make prestigious movies, he made genre pictures. Um, when Billy Wilder made Double Indemnity, he took what was considered lower class material and made it as an A picture with big stars. I mean, Barbara Stanwyck was the highest paid woman in Hollywood when she made that film. And I just think that it defines the genre. So you have to understand and take all of this that I say with a grain of salt because because people ask like if I just had to watch one movie to understand film noir, I say then watch Double Indemnity because you're going to get it, right? It's exactly where you started with they know what they're doing is wrong and they do it anyway. That's the classic example of it is that Fred McMurray knows precisely what he's doing and it's probably not going to turn out well, but he can't stop himself. He does it anyway. And you definitely get the sense, even though they don't go into her backstory, you get the sense that she's done this before, right? She probably killed, like in the book, it's made clear that she killed her husband's previous wife. She was her nurse and she actually like killed the woman to get her home and her life and everything. You know, they leave that out of the movie, but and
Well, sorry for the interruption, but those i- innuendos are like another key for film noir. I was watching something at stake yesterday. Can you remember the movie? Um,
sometimes I you got to give me a year. Sometimes a life at stake. Well, that would make sense now, wouldn't it? Yes.
and it was full of innuendos like yes yes I want to meet you by night, but why, but why you know, and we don't see any explicit sex. We don't see that, but we are full of innuendos in these movies.
Yes. It's funny you say that because uh that's something that people love about these films. A lot of the a lot of the people who because I have a TV show in the United States where I present film noir every weekend, and a lot of the people who watch it, they love the fact that they don't see the sex. They don't hear the bad language in these movies because they were made in an earlier time in which there was a production code in effect that prohibited those things from being said. It's interesting to note that film noir, these movies, were pushing the envelope back then as to what was permissible on screen because they all the plots revolve around people doing the worst possible things they can do. They're just not graphically presented. So to your point precisely, take double indemnity into schools and I have shown it in high schools and in colleges, universities, and I show it to younger people to explain to them how movies used to be. So I show them the scene in Double Indemnity in which Fred McMurray and Barbara Stanwyck meet for the first time in her house, right? And it is, as you say, nothing but innuendo. It's one after another, right? It's all suggested. But I say to the class, they're like, because they don't see anything like this today. They don't hear anything like it or see anything like it. And I say, what do you think the point of this scene is? They don't miss it. They know what the point is, right? Oh, he wants to get her, he's hot for her and she's devious and she's got another scheme in mind and all. And I said, so see, you understand the scene completely. You're not missing anything, but here's why it's done the way it's done. And then I explained that you couldn't show blatant sex. You couldn't have you can't make it that obvious back in the 1940s. And and then I win them over, I hope, by saying, your great grandparents were just as horny as you are. you know, I mean, this is what they were interested in when they went out to the movies at night. Nothing changes, right? Nothing really changes. It's just what was permissible on screen has changed. And
Well,
and once they engage that way, then all of a sudden they're not looking at the movies as if they're dated and antiques and corny, like, oh, people don't really talk like that. You have to explain to them why they're talking like that and indicate that the motives are the same, whether it's 1943 when they made Double Indemnity or 2023. It's the same story.
well, yeah, but you said that uh, you you wrote your noir books because most of the noir books written were like so academic, like so for scholars, because these are not only movies. These are sociological, philosophical, anthropological stuff of the American dream broken forever, and you can see this, for example, in a, and I want to rescue some actors as well. Mike Mazurki, I guess I'm pronouncing it correctly, in a Philip Marlowe movie that was with Dick Powell, and you see drugs there, for example, and it is so and actually he says I was high on coke or something like that, and you don't see that in other movies before. This is the American dream broken.
Well, interestingly, you did see that in movies in America before 1934. I mean, that was a big thing because a lot of what we now call pre-code movies dealt with sex and drugs and there's oh, I'm drawing a blank on the title now, but there's an Edward G. Robinson movie from the early 30s where he explicitly says, I must be high on coke, or and which is just startling for a movie from like 1932. But in 1934, Hollywood, because it was there were so many scandals that had happened to damage the reputation of Hollywood that they really took enforcement of the production code very seriously. And so 10 years passed in which movies were really cleaned up. And then it was noir films that started, you know, creeping back into suggesting all of this other stuff. So yes, the Dick Powell movie is Murder My Sweet, and there's a whole scene where he gets injected with these drugs and he's high as a kite, uh and there are other examples of it. There's a movie that's very hard to find from 1949 called Manhandled, where the two main characters, Sterling Hayden and Art Smith, actually do benzodrine. They do uppers and downers back to back. and the filmmakers play it as a big joke because they're so amped up in one scene where they're just high, and then they're playing the next scene as though they're underwater because they're so slowed down, and it's amazing how this stuff got past the censors. uh, but you make an interesting point about the American dream. I always say that film noir is a cultural landmark because it's where America really began to lose its innocence as far as popular entertainment goes. We could no longer convince ourselves that we were flawless, right? We because film noir grew out of the Depression. It grew out of the Great Depression in this country, which was basically a catastrophic failure of the capitalist system. That was what brought about the Depression. And so much of crime fiction and crime movies of the 1930s were a reaction to that. Like the common man got screwed because the system that was supposed to protect him failed, right? And so what do we have except to turn to crime? And then by the time film noir came around, much of film noir suggests, well, the criminals just moved into higher places. The criminals are now running the city, and by extension, they're running the whole system. And you can't get a break. And that idea that the common person is never going to get a leg up in this system is what I think informs a lot of film noir.
And well, I never thought about it, and actually comes another idea comes to my mind, that is, yes, um the city is struck by crime, but also the system, in the sense that who are the heroes here, or the anti-heroes? Freelancers, detectives, mainly like lousy in some sense, that don't dress well, that they can barely pay their bills, but in some way or another they end up being heroes, like in The Big Sleep. It's like such a weird movie, and Bogart is like always well, I guess he was drunk in the movie, but it has that sense of being totally careless about anything, and that is part of, okay, a guy that is not a cop, is just a detective, a private detective.
You've That's a very, very important distinction, and one that I make all the time, is that detectives are not in the business of upholding the law. Detectives are paid mercenaries. They do what the client asks them to do, right? And so you get these wonderfully morally complex stories where the detective is hired to do something, and halfway through his investigation he finds out this is a typical thing, that it's the person who hired him who is the culprit, right? Who is guiltier than anybody else, is the especially if they're rich.
So there is not a good character. There are no, like, values in that sense. For example, again, in the Big Sleep, you cannot take part, because everyone is the bad guy or the bad girl. So there are no people to be like to feel empathy for.
Well, that's interesting, man. I love the fact that you chose that word because I think that empathy is a vital ingredient in film noir. And what's interesting about it is the writers of these things, and very often the directors and actors, are playing it in such a way that they want you to have empathy for someone that isn't doing the right thing. Like they want you to understand what are the circumstances that could make someone so desperate that they're going to screw up their whole life for whatever, I need the money, so I'm going to do this stupid bank job, or I have to have this woman, so I'm going to make a bad decision and do this. And rather than presenting it in such a way that you're at a remove and saying, boy, they're stupid. It's like watching a horror movie where you can't believe that they're going to actually go into that house. Like, why are they doing that? That's the stupidest thing imaginable. It's the kind of in film noir, it's the same thing. It's like, this isn't going to turn out well. But the best noir makes you empathize with those characters anyway. Like, I could be that person. I
Like,
could make that mistake.
like in the end, do you do you have empathy for Harry Fabian, for example?
As I describe it, and you're referring now to Night in the City, Jules Dassin's great film with Richard Widmark, that is such a classic film. And I love the fact that the only decent thing that guy does in the entire movie is die. That's the only decent thing he does, right? Because he's miserable up until the very end when he knows if he goes out and sacrifices himself, he's going to save these other characters. So he basically goes out and yells at the gangster, knowing full well he's going to be killed. Uh, but it's his only decent act in the entire movie, and he kind of redeems himself at the end by dying. He's
I I
so
I, I
he's so
always
wretched.
I always feel bad when Mike Mazurki kills the Greek guy. I can't remember the name.
Yes, yes, I know what you mean.
It's like you watch the film several times and you don't want to end like that, because you know that Harry Fabian is a crook, and but just it's really hard to imagine, because this movie was actually remade in the 90s with Robert De Niro, and I have to say that it doesn't have the magic. I don't know if you share that view.
No, I totally agree. It does not have the magic. And wow, if you want to discuss reasons why, I'm happy to go into that because I think it's not uncommon for remakes of the classic films to fall flat, because they're just not made in the same way. I mean, there's just this spectacular uh, Jules Dassin's approach to making that film is so baroque. It's so visually stunning, and it has no. Um, it's not required to be realistic. It's something beyond realism. It creates its own world that we recognize as London, but it's this really expressionistic version of London. And the performances are the same way, it's not realistic. When they remake these films, and Irwin Winkler remade Night in the City, it's just too there's too much naturalism to it, right? And I'm not saying that naturalism is bad. I'm just saying that if you're comparing the two, the one that's going to stick in your head and is going to be unforgettable is the one that has, as you put it so perfectly, it has the magic, right? Because they're not interested in being realistic. The same thing is true of one of my favorite noir films is a movie called Crisscross from 1949 that Robert Siodmak made. He is my favorite director of film noir. And it's very similar to Night in the City in its conception and its visualization of Los Angeles is the same kind of thing that Dassin did in London. It's like it's magic realism, Los Angeles. It's not the real city, it's beyond that. But when Steven Soderbergh remade Crisscross as a film called The Underneath, uh, it just didn't have the same feel. It was just like, Peter Gallagher was playing the Burt Lancaster part, and no offense to Peter Gallagher, he's a fine actor, but he's not Burt Lancaster, right? And I I'm sorry to say, I can't even remember the actress who played the Yvonne DiCarlo role, which goes to show you, it's just it doesn't stick in your mind the same way.
I don't know why, but a movie that actually got stuck on my mind that is, actually for me was very weird, but you kind of emphasize as a really good movie is how is this name? Gone Crazy. Gone Crazy. Yeah, it's really weird for me. I don't know what do you see in that movie.
Oh, you mean you didn't like it so much?
No, no, it was odd for me.
It is an odd film, and one of the things I love about that movie is it's relentless. It I don't know if you're aware that I wrote an entire book about this
Yes,
about
yes, 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 yes. Exactly, yes.
and I just found the way it skirted the production code because nothing in that movie was going to be allowed. And in writing that book, I discovered, wow, the producers of that film, the King brothers, tried for 5 years to get that movie made. And the production code office was like, you can't make this movie. What's wrong with you? And everything that they demanded they change about the script, in the end, just made the movie that much more amoral. It was like you couldn't give motivate because the motivation for the main character was that he was an abused child and he was beaten by his outlaw father, and that's why he carried a gun, because he felt he needed protection. Well, the production code office said, "Oh no, no, we don't want to have the implication that father figures are abusive to their offspring. We can't do that. So take that out." And so when you take out the motivation, you're just left with a guy who loves guns. That's it. He just loves guns. And you know, the thing that they never mention in that movie that I find so fascinating is that the guy's a virgin. The guy has never had sex. I mean, it's pretty obvious that the guns are a big substitute for him. And then he finally meets a woman who is very comfortable with sidearms and weaponry and everything, and she's going to give him an education that he's never going to forget. And it's just such a bizarre movie. And I just love the fact that the filmmakers just go at it whole hog, even though it was so rare for the time to have a movie in which their characters are really not explained. They're just outlaws. They're just criminals.
I was looking for a movie actually that I cannot find, and well, yeah, because there are so many movies that, well, this is the case with film noir actually that uh, I heard that, well, actually you have to restore many of these movies because they weren't available, and I want to know if before the Film Noir Foundation, that is from 2005, I guess, and if before that it was, I won't say easy, but if you go to a video store or something, you will get, because film noir, because now you have like the Criterion collection or you have these DVD sets, but now we're in 2023. There's actually a Noir Foundation. So how was before 2005?
Okay, I can answer that exactly. Um, we save movies that were made independently of movie studios, right? So and then I hope we'll be able to talk about the Argentine films that I've been involved in restoring. Because that took me down a whole different road that has been so gratifying.
Because Eddie, I watch the Noir Alley. He said I host a show in TCM. It's called the Noir Alley. I don't know if in Argentina it's available, but you can see at least the intros and outros in YouTube. So watch the Noir Alley because you will see people, for example, like Olga Subarri in El Ángel Desnudo, that is, I guess, it was directed by Carlos Hugo Christensen. So, well, I wanted to mention that thing about the Noir Alley, that it's a great it's more than something for culture.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So what we discovered is prior to, let's just say, the DVD revolution, right? Because when I started getting into this, most of the stuff that I watched for research purposes was on videotape. There were VHS tapes that I would, and a lot of them weren't even factory made. They were just tapes that were recorded off television by people who saw them years and years ago, right? But then with the DVD revolution, a lot of the studios started putting out sets of noir films. Warner Brothers did a whole bunch, Fox did a bunch, Sony, which owns the Columbia Studios library, did a bunch of stuff. But where I realized films were missing was because I started programming my film festivals in at the turn of the century, like around 2000. I started doing live film festivals, and it was very difficult to get a lot of the movies, especially right at that point. You couldn't show a videotape. And digital technology was not sufficient to, you couldn't screen it in a movie theater back in the early part of this century. So you had to have a 35 millimeter print. But what I learned very quickly is that there were a lot of independently made films that were only distributed by a studio. They weren't made at the studio. So, for example, the first film that we restored was Joseph Losey's The Prowler, independently made by a company called Horizon Pictures, distributed by United Artists. Cry Danger was an independently made film by Dick Powell, distributed by RKO, but not after a point, not owned by RKO. So all of the films that I have restored, this is the case. They were lost because they no longer had an owner. They become what are called orphans. And so we can, if we can find original elements for these films, we can restore them and put them out on Blu-rays and get them back in circulation. That's what we have done.
And of course, what happened to Argentina?
Well, what happened in Argentina was nothing short of miraculous in terms of my life. In 2008, I traveled. My wife and I were planning on taking a trip to Buenos Aires anyway. And I asked, I always like to meet people and have it set up in advance. Like, I'm going to go there and I'm going to talk to this person or that person. And bear with me. This is a somewhat complicated story, but it's really great. I'm happy to have the opportunity to tell it. So I connected with a fellow named Ruben Guzman, who's a cinematographer and a documentarian in Argentina. And Ruben was introduced to me by my friend Guy Madden, the Canadian filmmaker. Ruben had shot a couple of movies for Guy, including a picture called The Saddest Music in the World with Isabella Rossellini. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but it's quite good. And so Ruben introduced me to Paula Felix Didier, who was at this point had just been appointed to head the Municipal Cinema Museum in Buenos Aires. And after I had met Paula and we'd spoken for a day or so, she said, "I really think you should meet Fernando." And there is one Fernando, yes. So this was my adventure in meeting Fernando, and it was so fascinating because it was like you had to pass a test. I felt like I had to pass the cinema test in order to get an audience with Fernando, right? And anyway, to make that long story short, we've met and we just hit it off. And he really, I mean, you obviously know all about Fernando, and he introduced me to so many of these great films uh, because he would invited me to Malba, where he was, the film curator, and he would basically screen his own prints, his own 16 millimeter prints for me in Spanish. They were not subtitled. And he was so great because he'd like come down and sit next to me. And when I could no longer follow the plot, he would explain to me what was going on. And some of those things were just a revelation, and I said, I can raise money to restore these films if you can find the original elements of these movies, because I didn't want to restore them from 16 millimeter, you know, and that's how our fabulous relationship began. And Fernando has just been my closest, comrade and confidant since 2008, and we've restored and preserved a lot of movies together.
Well, I think that we can name a few of them. La Dama del Lago, it's one of them. I don't know another one.
We have restored Apenas un Delinquente, this picture by Ugo Fregonese from 1949. And we preserved a movie called No Abras Nunca Esa Puerta.
Oh, my favorite movie ever in Argentina. Yeah, 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 yeah. That and If I Die Before I Wake. That is those two movies by Carlos Hugo Christensen. Those two movies, my God, it's
Well, you in 2024, I can't promise you're going to see If I Die Before I Wake as a restored film because it's very very deteriorated. We preserved it. It is viewable, but it would be incredibly expensive to try to digitally get the flaws out of it. But No Abras No Se Esa Puerta, you will see a gorgeous, pristine version of that film next year.
wow. This is amazing, and actually, it connects with another thing that I was about to mention, that are the writers. Uh, No Abras Nunca Esa Puerta. It's actually based on William Irish um, tales. Yeah, short stories, and they are really when I saw that movie, I think you you can even play or even this today. It's unwatchable for part. It's so um, vicious. It's so sinister. I don't know. It has that thing. So I don't know if you found something that you said, okay, if this was made in the USA, it could be a total hit.
No question about it. I mean, William Irish, who also his real name is Cornell Woolrich, and more movies were made in the United States from his stories than any other writer at that time. So it was a revelation to me that his popularity exceeded national boundaries. I mean, I've discovered that there were versions made in Mexico, there's versions in Argentina, there were versions of his films made in Europe, in Japan. It's extraordinary, and he died broke. And anyway, I'm so happy to know that you love that movie because I'm very excited about bringing that back. And um, we also restored two movies by a director named Roman Vignoli Barreto. La Bestia debe morir, The Beast Must Die, and El Vampiro Negro, which is the unknown version of Fritz Lang's M. And I'm probably more proud of that restoration than anything else we've done, just because it was a completely forgotten part of film history. And I have a lot of colleagues in Europe, and nothing is more gratifying than telling a French cinephile that there's a movie they don't know anything about. It's like, and I remember distinctly telling Bertrand Tavernier, I said, "Well, what do you think of the third version of M, the one from Argentina?" And he's like, "What? What? What are you talking about?" And I said, "Ah, I have I have this version, and you haven't seen it, and it will be a revelation to you." And it's a remarkable film. And you
And
wanna know something really strange? So you go halfway around the world and you find this film, and it was not easy to work all this out, but God bless Fernando that he knows what he's doing, right? And Luis Gaea at Argentine Sono Films has been very cooperative because these are still films that are belong to Argentine Sono Films, but he's very happy to have somebody come in and do something with them. So here we go. I restore this film and we're going to show it in San Francisco. And Vinuet Barreto's son, Daniel, emails me and says, "I see you're showing this movie. I would like to come and watch it." And I said, "Great. Where are you?" And he goes, "I live about an hour away up in this little town, Sonoma in California." And amazingly, Daniel lived about a half a mile from where my family used to have a house in Sonoma. So I mean, all that globe trotting and finding stuff buried halfway around the world, and then you end up making this personal connection with the filmmaker's son, and he's like in your backyard practically.
well, some of that stuff actually makes me like sad in a way, because when I talk to my students, I said, "You didn't watch, I know, The Big Sleep or Out of the Past or The Setup." No, a thousand times no. So I don't know. Maybe in America it's, I know, maybe bigger because of TCM, or actually it's called the classic movie. So I don't know, but do you think that noir is hitting to the people with less than 30 years, or it's like for actually a niche, and it's like it's going to be like that forever?
Yes, it will. It is a niche, and it always will be. It may have even been a niche when it was originally created, right? So, although it was, as I like to say, it was Hollywood's only organic artistic movement, because there was no reason for any of this to happen other than the artists wanted to do it. It wasn't like the movies were gigantic hits. They really weren't. I mean, there's very few of them. Like Gilda, The Postman Always Rings Twice, The Killers, Double Indemnity. Those were hit movies. But all the movies that were inspired by those films did not make a lot of money, but they didn't lose money either, which was really important because the economics of the movie business back then were very different than they are now. Back then, you could have, if a film turned a modest profit, it was okay. That was good. We didn't lose money, and we kept our people working, because you have to remember, in a studio had all these departments. It had a prop department and a music department, and all these people who were making a living making movies. So as long as they kept everybody working and the studio made money, that was okay. Today, that doesn't exist. Everything has to be a colossal hit, right? And there have to be a million people financing the film. And then it has to have, a big opening weekend and all that kind of nonsense. And I've never understood that. I don't get I don't know how it is in Argentina. You're going to tell me right now. When a movie opens, do they talk about how much money it made, or do they talk about how many people went to see it?
No, they talk. Well, it depends, but if it is like a let's say like a death in Buenos Aires that try to be at it by my point of view a not so good movie about crime movies like one of James Cagney. Um, it was a very hype, but but it doesn't count mm, money. It counts the hype, the selling in the sense of marketing, in the sense of distributing platforms in theaters. But no, I wouldn't say that. I will talk about prestige, like El Secreto de sus Ojos that won an Oscar. It's about more than prestige than making money in Argentina.
I see. But it to me it's very interesting because like in France, they don't they don't talk about how much money the film made. They talk about how many tickets were sold. So they're counting so that you can compare in France the popularity of movies across eras because they're counting the number of people that went to see it. They're not counting how much they paid for a ticket, which is absurd because in this country, it's embarrassing, really, because look, Oppenheimer and Barbie were the two big movies that just opened, and there are all these stories about how much money they made on the opening weekend. Well, I can tell you right now that those two movies cost more. It cost you more to buy a ticket to those movies than any two movies made in the United States prior to this. A single ticket costs more. So how can it not be making that much more money? It doesn't tell you how many people are actually going to see it. They're only telling you that it made, $140 million dollars at the box office last weekend or something. And it's like, that's not telling me how many people saw it because all those theaters can charge a different ticket price. But I was showing my old noir movies at a theater that was also showing Barbie, and they were charging, $20 to see Barbie, $20 to go to the movies, and it's like, you got to be kidding me. So you compare that to a movie made 25 years ago, the ticket was going to cost $7. 20 years ago, it would have cost you $6 or $7 to go to the movie. So you can't tell me that, you know, suddenly Barbie's the most successful movie ever made. No, 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 no.
Uh,
Anyway, that's off the track, but that's a bone I always pick because it's like, why are people so interested in how much money it's making when they should be asking how many people are actually interested in seeing the film?
I don't know if you ever watched this film called Fantozzi from Italy. It's called blue collar blues. No, white collar blues in the United States. No, it's a very rare movie. No one ever watched it. It's like a classic in, but only in Italy. I I will encourage every single people to watch Fantozzi. I just when I was 10 years old, I was surfing channels, and then this bizarre movie appeared, and no one knows it. But if I meet someone from Italy, it's like talking about Pee Wee Herman or something like that. But but communist, and the guy writes dark history.
Year was it? What year was it made?
1975, the first one, and Il Secondo Tragico Fantozzi, 1976. It was written by the same guy that was acting, Paolo Villaggio, and it's amazing. It's perfect and it's really bitter. Some people cry, some people laugh, but it's really, really bitter. But moving from that, from Italy to France, um, well, of course, film noir is a French term, and it's weird because there is an adaptation that I actually like most of Pepe Le Mocó, that it's Algiers. I don't know what do you think about that adaptation.
You mean the Hollywood version of Pepe Le Mot, the one with Charles Boyer
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
not Jean Gabin? Yeah. Well, I'm a big Jean Gabin fan, so I prefer the original Pepe Le Moko, but Algiers is not a bad film. It's better than people give it credit for. That's for sure.
Yeah, and it's really a forgotten movie. And talking about that, I will, I would like to mention some actors that are, for me, are totally forgotten. For example, like Edward Robinson, that you've forgotten that the woman in the window is excellent. It has a great plot, and it's uh it it has this class, uh this guy, and it's also in uh Double Indemnity is the boss. So it's really, it's really it is an amazing actor, and I don't think that anyone cares about it.
Well, you have to understand, because I have a television show, I hear from people who care quite a bit, right? But I do understand that in the grand scheme of things, it that passion is sort of marginal, right? You're absolutely right to assume if I went out, if I left my house now and talked to 20 people and I said, "What do you think of Edward G. Robinson?" I'm going to say 16 of those people wouldn't know who I was talking about, right? But four of them would, and they would have a favorite film. They would argue that Scarlet Street is better than The Woman in the Window, or vice versa, or they'd be angry that Edward G. Robinson never won an Oscar.
Yes,
So
and
I mean, that's kind of, you know that's pretty par for the course in my life. It's like I am connected directly to a very, very passionate group of people who love all of this stuff. But then when I'm not with those people, I'm aware that the stuff I'm interested in barely registers in the culture at large.
yeah, because I totally understand that, because when you mention, for example, Night of the Hunter, that was directed by Charles Lawton, that it's actually weird for me because he's such a great actor, but then he is the movie director of a really weird film that, um, if you mention that,
Right.
yeah, but it's really weird, it has this odd images, and if you mention that in the streets, no one's going to care. No one.
Well, yeah, I'm afraid you're right, uh but that film is a little more well known than you might think in this country. It's a because of Robert Mitchum. Because Robert Mitchum is the star, and he's the one who's made the film kind of a culturally significant in America. And I agree with you completely that it's a very weird film because it's the darkest, meanest fairy tale, because that's what it is, right? I mean, it really is a kids movie. It's about this ogre, this monster that comes to haunt their dreams, and he's the incarnate, and Lillian Gish is, the savior of these kids with her shotgun on her lap, and it's just like a children's story. It's like a fairy tale, and it's fabulous. My magazine. I publish a magazine through my foundation, and uh, our next issue has a story about, because I didn't know this. that the Night of the Hunter is actually based on a true crime story.
Whoa.
That there was a man named Harry Powers who was the basis for the character that Davis Grubb, who wrote the novel Night of the Hunter, kind of based the novel on this guy's really notorious exploit. He was way worse than the character Mitchum plays in the movie, but no movie could show that back then. So I think that's why Lawton went a more um, phantasmagoric approach to the material. And let me ask you this, since you're probably the only other person I know who has seen If I Die Before I Wake, doesn't the last reel of that movie remind you very much of Night of the Hunter? When he's tracking the little girl with the crumbs and she's leaving the little chalk marks on the road and he goes to the killer's house, and
Now
it's
that I think
like
about it, yes.
it
Yes.
has the same kind of, it's like you're seeing this through the eyes of a child. It's so terrifying. It makes you feel like you're a child looking. The world suddenly gets so big at the end of that movie, and that house is so scary. And the end of that movie, I was stunned with how terrifying it actually was. That
Eh,
that the villain like has a razor, and the way these kids are threatened. Oh my god, it was horrifying.
I don't know if it qualifies as noir, but the third man was actually um I wouldn't say remade, but the last scene of Daniel Tiner's movie that I cannot remember now uh it's like the same. It's like this sewers persecution, and you have that in Argentina. But in Argentina we have this issue that those well, as you know, trying to see those movies. And actually I really like movie director that is called Leonardo Fabio, and I saw his films on YouTube, so I went to buy the original copy, and they saw with the same quality. It showed the same quality. It's really sad. So I don't know. In the United States, do you have like some like this is um something for national culture or something, and the government takes part in restoring?
No, no. Uh, well, they want you to think that we have an institution, a government funded institution called the Library of Congress. But the Library of Congress can only do so much. I mean, I have worked with them, they have a good film collection, but it is not their mission to maintain a national film archive. It's really just a repository for things that people don't want to privately own anymore. So they give the films up, right? For example, there was a there's a movie, a B movie from the 40s called The Devil Thumbs a Ride. And for various reasons, the owners of the movie, which is Warner Brothers, don't want to release the film or do anything with it because they cannot clear the literary rights because it's based on a novel that was written in the 40s by a man named Robert Dussault. So they just say, we're not going to make any money with this movie ever again. So they give it to the Library of Congress to just store it because they don't want to destroy it. Thank God. Well, we went in and co-funded the restoration of this film with the Library of Congress. The only problem with this is we can't show the film in the United States because Warner Brothers won't allow it because they still own the rights to the movie. So I have shown this movie in Europe. I've shown this movie all over the place. I just can't show it in the United States. That's how silly a lot of these laws are. It's absurd.
It's always about money. It's really about
Yes, it
money.
is.
and that it's really sad. But I was thinking you actually make like uh like a special let's say part in your book um for John Crawford. That is it was forgotten, but it is forgotten, but it was such a big hit back in the day. And I will say, with her, Lauren Bacall, those are a must. And I have to say also that in a noir movie, you don't really need to have a femme fatale. You know, it can be like another role for a woman, right?
Of course, of course. No, I completely agree with that. In fact, I don't accept Lauren Bacall sort of pretended to be a femme fatale in movies. She was the pretend femme fatale in The Big Sleep. She's not really a bad woman. She rarely played a bad woman. Um, the same is sort of true of Joan Crawford, who was more, the working woman, like in Mildred Pierce and in Possess. I mean, things go wrong, and she's definitely a noir protagonist. Um, but I don't. I agree with what you're saying. Uh, you don't have to have a femme fatale for it to be a noir film. And generally, when you do have a femme fatale, there is always another woman in the plot who is presented as the alternative to the bad woman. And if the guy was only smart enough to realize that, he would go with her instead. You know, it's sort of the classic example I use is in Vertigo, that Jimmy Stewart, right? He completely falls for this illusion that Kim Novak is creating of this glamorous mystery woman, and he's blind to the deceit behind it all. But here's Barbara Bel Geddes, who plays his friend Midge, who is the perfect person for him, right? I mean, he should just be with her, and things would have gone much better. And generally in film noir, you find that. Like, I don't know whether this was something imposed by the production code or whether this was just something the writers themselves, a point they wanted to make. Because it's very interesting for the times how progressive some of these female characters are, because because they are totally self-sufficient. They're doing men's work. They're working in publishing. They're fashion designers. They're doing all this stuff, doctors and nurses. And the guys end up falling for the sexy woman who doesn't want to work for a living. That's basically what the femme fatale is. And she's like, I can't get it on my own. I'm going to use this guy, and he's going to steal the money for me, or I can play him for a sucker. And that's the dichotomy, if you will, in these movies. Is it's less about inherent gender stuff than it is about a class and an economic thing, where the women don't want to work for a living. If there's a bad woman in a movie, she does not want to work for a living. That's right. And the women who are like the salvation of men are the women who will work. They're
Exactly.
self-sufficient. They're self-sufficient and they've got it going on. Like, I want to be with you because I want to be with you, not because I want to take advantage of, your situation. So that, which I found pretty progressive for the time. And it's one of the reasons why I disagree with people who say film noir is kind of a misogynistic thing where it presents women as evil and deceitful. And it's like, well, yeah, those are some of the characters, but you're not watching closely enough, because the only really good characters in film noir are those sensible professional women.
And also, well, those, because I don't want to forget about it. I want to talk about a little bit of the setup that is the like I know if the first boxing film ever, I don't know, and
Might be the best.
okay, okay, and this is a really tricky one. Who is your favorite Philip Marlowe actor?
um, it's funny. It's a guy who never played the part. Because I always say William Holden would have been perfect to play the role of Philip Marlowe, but he never did. So, but of the ones who did, um, I'm kind of partial to Bogart, I think, but I also think Dick Powell did a pretty good job in Murder My Sweet. There was a TV movie made years later with an actor named Powers Booth who was who was very good as Marlowe. Um, and although I didn't love him when I first saw it, I'm kind of coming around on Elliot Gould in The Long Goodbye. I mean, I know it's a totally different thing. It's not the character that Raymond Chandler wrote, but I just like the whole conceit of that film.
Well,
I like the way Robert Altman was playing with the genre, and I thought Elliot Gould was pretty good. And then years later, I actually heard Elliot Gould do an audio book where he read The Long Goodbye, just straight, the actual novel. He read it, and he was really good. I mean,
well,
he it was a totally different take on the character. He played it straight, not the way Altman wanted him to do it, and it was really good.
well, Robert Mitchum was a Philip Marlowe as well, right?
He was, but
I
I know you're saying why did he leave out Robert
no, no,
Mitchum?
no, 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 because it was like a when I saw him playing Marlowe, it's like it's so like overreacting. Like I know like a superstar. I know.
I completely agree. Even when I saw that film when it came out, and I was a teenager, and I still said this guy's too old now. They missed it. You know, it was 10 years too late. And and Robert Mitchum is not my idea of Philip Marlowe anyway. You know, William Holden is more my idea of Philip Marlowe. I mean, he's um, Mitchum looks like a kind of guy who can just beat up anybody. It's like, you know, they just redid this Marlowe thing with Liam Neeson playing the part, and it's like if they could have found somebody less like Marlowe than Mitchum, they did because he's totally wrong for the part. You
And
know,
you know, I'm not a big fan of a movie that everyone loves. That is Chinatown. Unless for the final part, but I don't know how because it is like the last noir film, let's say from an era. I don't know if that is correct, but I don't know. How do you evaluate that?
it's I know what you mean. Well, I will say this: I think that Chinatown is the best detective story movie ever made, and I may be partial to the fact that I know the history, the California history that it's drawing from to tell that story, and I think it's such a beautiful way of using historical fact in a fictional way to tell a detective story. And I have such admiration for Roman Polanski as a director. I just think his direction of that movie is almost it is to me it's flawless. You know, it's not everybody's cup of tea. I know a lot of people who just it turns them off. You know, but wow, for a movie that about corruption and personal and social corruption. I don't know if Hollywood's made a better one, to be honest.
Taxi Driver, for example, will be
Well, I do consider Taxi Driver to be a film noir, definitely, and a movie that had a huge impact on me when I first saw it. You know, I mean, I remember seeing it the day it came out,
how was it?
and overwhelming, like literally a life changing experience. Both those two movies, Chinatown and Taxi Driver, were in fact life changing experiences for me, because they're unlike anything I'd seen before, especially Taxi Driver. It just I don't think the culture was quite prepared for that movie when it came out, and I don't think you could see a movie. I don't know that a movie could have that kind of impact, cultural impact today. I don't in this country. I don't think it would get made, and if it did get made, it would be very marginalized. There was a Lynn Ramsey made a film recently with Joaquin Phoenix. I think it was called I Was Never Here. I don't know if you've seen it. And it's very much like a Taxi Driver for the modern audience. And nobody saw it. I mean, it had absolutely no impact. It's a good film, but nobody knows about this movie at all.
How would you define when film noir ends? Because I mean, of course, there are film, as we said in the beginning, that um, something wild has noir elements, but it's not film noir. So when does film noir end?
Okay, this is a very pertinent question. And the thing that's interesting is this is why people say, is it a genre, whatever? And I say no. To kind of comprehend this and to get your arms around it, you have to really think of it as I described it previously, an organic artistic movement. So instead of saying what is film noir, when did it start and when did it end, I say the film noir movement really began in the early 1940s and it ended around 1960. And the two films that, and I will say, The Maltese Falcon is sort of the beginning, not because it looks like film noir, but because the attitude that Bogart projected in that film. This is where we started talking, right? About he's a detective hero. He doesn't uphold the law, he acts by his own code. All of these things were very important to popularizing the idea of the anti hero in American culture. Then in 1944, everything took off because then you had Double Indemnity and Phantom Lady and The Woman in the Window and Laura and Murder My Sweet. All of these movies were released literally within weeks of each other. And so something was clearly happening, right? And that movement lasted from 1944 up to like around 1952, like where a lot of films. Then it diminished because movies changed to combat the to combat television because television became so popular. Everybody started buying a television, so the movies changed and they got widescreen, Technicolor to attract audiences to the theaters. And a lot of noir actually moved to television, at least in the United States. You got television series like Alfred Hitchcock Presents and Suspense and Playhouse 90 and these things that were basically made by the same people that were making film noir, same writers, same directors. Jacques Tourneur directed television and Nicholas Ray directed television. Joseph H. Lewis directed television. Um, but I like to say the end and the beginning came with two films in 1960. Um, Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless was so obviously an homage to film noir, but done in a totally different way that it changed cinema. Right, movies weren't going to be made the same way after that. The other film was Psycho, because Psycho completely starts as a film noir. For the first third of Psycho, it might as well be a film noir. It's shot in black and white. A woman is having an illicit affair with this guy. She steals money to start fresh. It's a classic film noir setup. And then it's not. And then it becomes something entirely different after her conversation with Norman in the motel. Everything is different. So those two films to me changed audiences, changed the way people were expected to make movies, and changed the audience's expectations of what they could see in a movie. And I think those two factors pretty much ended classic film noir as we know it. Everything after that is somebody riffing on it or inspired by it or extending it in some interesting way. And that continues to this day. I mean, filmmakers like Christopher Nolan, he knows his film noir. David Lynch knows his film noir. Uh, Steven Soderbergh definitely, he knows his noir. The Coen brothers, I mean, for gosh, they did The Man Who Wasn't There, was totally an homage to film noir. So I think now you see derivations of film noir, but the movement's over. I mean, that was its own thing.
And well, I wanted to finish by mentioning a recommendation that we were talking about of that is Dead End, and it's with as you said, with Bogart not being the star. So I highly recommend that gruesome film. And well, for finishing the interview, Eddie, I will like to ask you three things to recommend a movie, whatever. It could be noir or whatever. A book, fiction or non-fiction, again, whatever. And for the Spotify listeners, a song.
Okay. Wow. Okay, let's see if I can do this. Okay, the book I'm going to recommend is by Dorothy B. Hughes. It's called The Expendable Man. And I love this book. I think Dorothy Hughes is a really underrated writer. A lot of her novels in the 40s were turned into film noir. The Fallen Sparrow and Ride the Pink Horse and In a Lonely Place. These were Dorothy Hughes novels. But in the early 60s, she wrote this book, The Expendable Man, which has thankfully been republished and which is a really interesting crime story that probably can't be adapted as a film because the jaw-dropping moment in the story where you realize you're reading along and you get like 60 pages in, and then something happens. She says something in passing, and you realize you've been wrong about the story all the way along because you've presupposed something about the protagonist of the story, and then you suddenly realize in this one moment everything you thought is incorrect, and it opens your eyes to looking at the world and the story in a totally different way. And so I love that book, and I've recommended it to a lot of people, and they've all loved it. As for a movie, what have I seen recently that I would? No, I haven't seen it yet. Haven't seen it yet. Well, I'll just say, my favorite movie is In a Lonely Place, the Dorothy B. Hughes story that's adapted by Nick Ray. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. I just think it's absolutely fantastic. And for a song on Spotify, one of my favorite noir songs. I love everything by Tom Waits. Tom Waits is my personal god. But there's a song called "The Road Goes On Forever."
I was about to say Rain Dogs. But
Rain Dogs. Oh, okay, yeah. One of the greatest albums ever made. Yes.
I mean, we can go with the two of them. So it's...
Okay, but "The Road Goes On Forever," written by Robert Earl Keen, but the version performed by Joe Ely is fantastic, and it's like a noir film in 3.5 minutes. It's great.
So that will be. So thank you so much, Eddie. Soy Facundo Guadagno y esto fue otro episodio de Diálogos.